Welcome. Tonight, we embark on a gentle journey across time and tongues. A story not of one king, or one war, or even one country, but of words. Familiar words. Words you speak, hear, and think in. Words like bread, road, sky, hello. You speak them without thinking. But why do you speak them in English? Why does the world from Tokyo to Nairobi, from Moscow to Sao Paulo, speak them to? Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe before you fall asleep. But only if you really like the content I make. Also, write in the comments where you are from and when you are watching. It is so interesting to see where people are watching from around the world. Thank you. English. A language that began in the misty hills of an island on the edge of Europe, shaped by migration, sharpened by conquest, and eventually, quietly, persistently carried by ships, books, treaties, and songs, across oceans and generations. But tonight, there is no need to hurry. We will follow the slow path. We will settle into the lives of those who lived and spoke English before it was powerful, before it was everywhere. Let your mind drift gently into the past. Imagine yourself waking to the creak of old timber and the faint rustle of sails beyond your shuttered window. You're in a modest house, tucked along a narrow cobbled lane in a coastal town. Somewhere on the southern edge of England, the year is 1700. The sun is still low, casting pale gold light over the rooftops. Outside, you hear the muted thump of wooden soles on stone, someone sweeping a stoop, perhaps, or pulling a cart toward the market. A gull cries distantly over the harbor, and the breeze carries with it the mingled scents of salt, tar, and morning. Bread. You rise slowly, stretching beneath a blanket patched with worn wool. The floorboards are cool underfoot. You move quietly, careful not to wake the others. Downstairs, the fire is long since gone out, but you rekindle it with practiced ease. Sparks catch on the kindling, and soon the familiar pop and crackle fills the room. You place a kettle near the edge of the flames, its metal rim glowing faintly in the growing warmth. You are a ship's clerk. You keep logs, you balance ledgers, and sometimes when asked, you write letters for sailors who never learnt their letters. But this morning, before the bustle begins, the town is still wrapped in its hush. Outside, ships shift lazily in the harbor. Great wooden vessels with names painted carefully along their hulls: the Swallow, the King's Mercy, Providence. Many fly the Red Cross flag of England. Others, flags of Portugal, France, the Dutch Republic. They come and go with the tide, and with them, so does the language. Down on the dock, a sailor greets another. The words are simple, worn down by wind and repetition. Mornin', aye, back to Portsmouth. These are not the English of the court or the scholar. They are the English of barrels and ballast, of trade routes and tides. In the market square, an older woman haggles for fish. She speaks with the rolling vowels of Devon, while the fishmonger's voice lilted north from Yorkshire. A boy selling apples uses slang picked up from a sailor who learned it in Barbados. Already, English is stretching, bending, carried like cloth, folded and reused. Later in the day, you'll write a shipping manifest. The cargo, wool, bricks of tea, jars of preserved lemons. The destination, Boston, in the colony of Massachusetts Bay. You know the name well, ships go there often. English is spoken there too, though its accent is strange and clipped. Your quill scratches lightly across the parchment, and you pause to consider the phrase. In good condition, you write it again and again. In good condition, the words will cross an ocean. Someone else will read them, perhaps in a warehouse 2 months from now. The language holds. By evening, the town grows quiet again. A pub glows warmly near the docks. Inside, men drink ale and speak in a dozen variations of English, thick with regional rhythms. Stories are told. Some are true, others comfortably not. And as the fire burns low and shutters are closed against the wind, you lie down once more in your little room, beside the harbor that connects your tongue to so many others. English still small in reach, but already slipping softly into sails. The town is behind us now. We drift gently away from the morning bustle of harbor life, and begin to follow the English language as it leaves its island home, carried by wind and sail, by treaties and textbooks, by clerks with ink-stained fingers and governors in woolen waistcoats. This is not a fast journey, nor is it a singular one. The British Empire did not burst onto the global stage fully formed. It came gradually, in fits and starts, sometimes by ambition, sometimes by accident, often by trade, often by force, but always, in its quiet shadow, came the language. Imagine now a map, unfurling slowly like parchment on a table. The British Isles sit small in the upper left corner, but soon, tiny threads begin to spread outwards, southward, eastward, across the sea. At first, it was Ireland, just across the water. Then Newfoundland, with its icy shores and thick fog. The West Indies followed Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, places where sugar plantations soon rose from cleared fields, and where English was imposed on those who were brought there in chains. Somber thought, but a true one. Languages, like empires, often grow in soil that has seen hardship. In India, a different story unfolded. The British arrived first as traders' employees of the East India Company, not kings, but accountants. They came for cloth and spices, but they stayed for power. Over time, the company became a government in all but name. Its officials set laws, collected taxes, and taught lessons in English. The schools were small at first. Simple buildings in Calcutta and Bombay, Madras and Delhi, but they grew. Young boys sat cross-legged on stone floors, repeating the new vocabulary: trade, river, crown, duty. They were not learning it for poetry or beauty. They were learning it because it was useful, a key to employment, to promotion, to opportunity in the new system taking root around them. Imagine one of those boys now. His name might be Arjun. He speaks Hindi at home, but in the classroom he recites in English. My name is Arjun. This is a book. I see the sun. The words are foreign at first, but over years they become comfortable, familiar, a second skin elsewhere. The process was similar, though the circumstances were different. In Africa, English arrived in waves. First at the coast, where forts were built for trade, then inland through railways and missions and administration. In Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, the British built roads, courts, schools. They imposed their systems and with them, their language, but not everyone learned the same English. The English of colonial Lagos was different from the English spoken in Cape Town or Nairobi. Each region shaped the language, bent it, softened it, mixed it with its own rhythms and tones. What emerged was not a single English, but many Englishes. Imagine a school in Accra, Gold Coast, what we now call Ghana. The air is warm. The teacher wears a faded suit. He stands before a chalkboard and writes. The governor will arrive on Tuesday. The students repeat, slowly, carefully. They do not speak this way at home, but they will need to speak this way in court, in commerce, in writing. In the Caribbean, the process was faster, more brutal. A plantation society with enslaved Africans brought to work under punishing sun created its own form of English creoles and patois that blended the syntax of West Africa with the vocabulary of the English overseers. These dialects carried trauma, yes, but also resilience. Storytelling, music, religion all adapted, and through it all, English remained, not because it was loved, but because it was there. In Australia, the story was one of displacement. English arrived with convicts and settlers. Indigenous languages were ignored, erased, replaced. Over time, English became the only tongue spoken in many regions, its accent softened by distance, its tone changed by sun and sand. In Canada, too, English moved slowly across the map, along rivers and trade routes, through treaties and skirmishes. In some areas, it met French and found compromise. In others, it became dominant. And so, by the late 1800s, the map had changed dramatically. You could travel from England to the Caribbean, to India, to Australia, to South Africa, and speak the same language, though not quite the same version of it. Imagine a civil servant in London, writing a letter to his counterpart in Delhi. The style is stiff, formal. I am in receipt of your memorandum dated the 12th of January. The reply comes months later, across seas and steam lines, written in the same careful script. Language traveling not by voice now, but by ink and paper, and still it spreads. The empire's size at its height is difficult to grasp. A quarter of the world's land, nearly a quarter of its people. English was not always their first language. Often it was not their second, but it was the language of courts, of contracts, of diplomacy. In many cases, it was also the language of refusal. You could not get the job, the loan, the promotion, unless you could read or write in English. It was a gate, a wall, a key. By the end of the 19th century, English had become more than just a local tongue. It had become an administrative language, a trade language, a legal language. It was not yet the global lingua franca it would become in the 20th century, but the foundations had been laid. And yet, even as the language spread, few in Britain could have guessed what it would become. Most still thought of it as their own. But languages, once loosed upon the world, are no longer property. They live where they are spoken, and English was now being spoken everywhere by millions of people who had never seen the white cliffs of Dover, who had never stepped foot on British soil. The empire had built ships and cities, schools and railways, but its most lasting export was invisible. Spoken, written, thought, the language itself. And so, as the 20th century approached, English was no longer a passenger. It had become a carrier of ideas, of law, of power. It had begun to settle into the bones of nations that would soon govern themselves, but continue to speak a colonial tongue. We leave the empire now, not with fanfare, but with a quiet observation in English. Had not conquered the world, but it had gone everywhere the empire had gone, and it would remain long after the empire was gone. Next, we'll turn to the language itself. Where did English come from before it was imperial? How did it survive before it was global, before it was everywhere? It was many things, and it still. Is it as easy to forget that English was once a minority language, small, regional, shaped by isolation, not dominance? The language we speak today did not arrive in the world fully formed. It was never pure. It was never stable. From its very beginnings, English was a gathering of sounds borrowed and blended, scraped from ships and manuscripts, whispered across fields and echoed in stone churches. Imagine the land that would one day be called England over 1,000 years ago. The Romans have come and gone. Their roads remain, their walls crumble in the rain, and their Latin lingers only in fragments. Now, the island is dotted with small kingdoms: Mercia, Wessex, Northumbriac, with its own dialect, each with its own slight variation of the new language taking root. This is Old English. It sounds almost nothing like the English you know. A stranger's tongue, rough and musical, built from the Germanic roots of the Angles and Saxons and Jutes. Words like Hirfon for heaven, Ir-E for earth, HLF for loaf. Words spoken around hearth fires and carved into runstones. Then came the Norse. Vikings arrived not just with swords, but with words. They settled, stayed, married, raised children. Their language, Old Norse, was close enough to mingle with the Anglo-Saxon speech. Soon, new words crept in. Sky, knife, egg, skin. Words simple and sharp, easy to remember. Grammar began to simplify. Verb endings fell away. Articles emerged. The man instead of say, mon. It was not a conscious change. It happened gradually, across kitchens and markets, where understanding mattered more than rules. And then, in 1066, came a deeper transformation. The Normans, speaking a version of Old French, crossed the Channel and took the English crown. With them came a new ruling class and a new layer of vocabulary. English did not disappear, endured quietly, in the mouths of peasants and laborers. But it was changed. French words seeped into the language of power. Court, justice, noble, royal, English became a layered tongue, Germanic at its root, French in its flourish, a language of both kingly rule and sovereign power. For centuries, this blend deepened. Writers like Chaucer used the mixed tongue to tell tales of pilgrims and pardoners. The English Bible, once forbidden, brought sacred phrases into common homes. By the time Shakespeare wrote of storms and stars, of daggers and dreams, English was no longer a rough peasant language. It was rich, expansive, capable of poetry and politics. But it was still changing. From Latin, it borrowed knowledge, words, like temperature, virtue, education. From Greek, it took science and philosophy, theatre, democracy, atmosphere. The printing press fixed spellings that had never been fixed before, and with it came the strange, silent letters we still carry. Night, det, hour. A fossil record of past pronunciations across the Atlantic. As settlers landed in North America, the language shifted again. Isolated from the homeland, American English grew on its own terms. New words arose from necessity and contact. Moccasin, raccoon, prairie, words from native languages, absorbed into the rhythm of a new world. Later, as English spread further into Africa, the Caribbean, South Asia, the Pacific absorbed again. Words from Hindi, Swahili, Malay, bungalow, safari, amok. Each one a footprint, a soft echo of where English had traveled and what it had learned. But even as it borrowed, it also lost. Dialects died. Local grammars were smoothed out by standardization. The English taught in schools, printed in dictionaries, broadcast over radio, was often chosen in boardrooms and classrooms far from where it was spoken. Still, variation survived. Even today, The English of Nigeria carries tones and rhythms shaped by Yoruba and Igbo speech patterns. Indian English is precise, often formal, and rich with idioms shaped by translation. Singaporean English, or Singlish, blends British syntax with Chinese, Malay, and Tamil vocabulary. None of these are wrong. They are English, just not the English of London, or Boston, or Toronto. What makes English so resilient is its flexibility. It accepts change. It bends, rarely breaks. It allows contradictions, silent letters, multiple meanings, set has over 400 definitions, run has dozens of verb forms, and yet we understand it is a language of metaphor. Time flies. We break hearts. Ideas catch fire. None of these things are literal, but they feel right, and it is a language of rhythm. Think of lullabies, of speeches, of everyday phrases. The iambic beat of a Shakespearean sonnet still echoes in a line like, "I think I'll go and get a cup of tea." This musicality is one reason English spread so easily in song. In the 20th century, as radio and cinema reached new corners of the world, English came not through textbooks, but through melody. The Beatles, singing across continents. Hollywood films, dubbed in some places, but subtitled in many others, letting the sound of the words filter through. Advertisements, cartoons, comic books. English became a background noise, a gentle presence, a language people began to absorb, without thinking. But beneath this casual spread was a deep history. A patchwork of invasions, adaptations, mistakes, inventions, 1,000 years of speaking, forgetting, reimagining. English, at its core, is not a finished language. It never was. It remains unfinished, evolving even now. And it is this quality, its softness, its looseness, its capacity to grow that allowed it to remain long after the empire that carried it had faded. It is no longer just a British language, or an American one, or a colonial one. It is, in a sense, a place where languages meet. We speak it differently. We spell it inconsistently. We argue about commas and laugh at autocorrect. Yet still we speak it. And so we continue, not with a beginning, but with a persistence. Now, let's drift forward past steamships and telegrams, past redcoats and chalkboards, to the quieter reign of the modern world, where English moves not by empire, but by email, by cinema, by search engine, not imposed now, but chosen, not one voice, but many. Let the scene drift now, slowly, carefully, from the age of steam and sail into the age of wires and satellites. The map has changed again. It is the early 20th century. The empire is still in place, but its grip is beginning to loosen. Across the globe, colonies are stirring. Movements for independence take shape. Protests rise, not in sudden shouts, but in steady, persistent waves. And still, the language remains. The First World War comes, not with horns and banners, but with mud, telegrams, and trench songs. It is fought across Europe, but its soldiers are drawn from everywhere: Canada, Australia, India, Africa. Many of them speak English, or are taught it, at least enough to follow orders, to read signs, to write home. In those years, English becomes the language of coordination, of command, of coded radio messages, carried crackling over long waves. It is not yet dominant, but it is useful. Then the war ends. The world reshapes itself. And then, scarcely a generation later, another war comes. The Second World War marks a turning point, not just in politics and technology, but in language, It is a war of alliances, of mass communication. Soldiers again come from all over the world, but this time the United States is deeply involved. Its economy, its culture, its vast resources all come into play, and with its involvement, the voice of American English grows louder. Imagine a radio, humming softly in a London kitchen during the Blitz. A British voice gives the news. Then, a pause. A different voice, American, confident, smoother, announcing support, sending messages of solidarity, of supplies, of troops, across Europe. American G is hand out chocolate and cigarettes, and with them, idioms. Okay, howdy, see you later. A different English, casual and warm, begins to take hold. When the war ends, America remains. Not militarily in all places, but economically, culturally, commercially. The Marshall Plan rebuilds Europe, and English becomes the language of trade. In Japan, General MacArthur oversees reconstruction. English is taught in schools, used in courts. In Germany, too, English finds a new foothold, not by force this time, but by necessity. A shared language for diplomacy, for rebuilding, for starting over. And then, just as the old world is trying to settle again, a new one begins to form quietly at first, through circuits and screens. The television arrives, grainy at first, then clearer, and many of the shows, the cartoons, the voices that flicker into homes across the globe, speak English. This is not empire, this is entertainment. Hollywood becomes a soft ambassador of language, not through political speeches, but through movies, musicals, science fiction, comedies. English becomes associated with glamour, with modernity, with escape, and still it spreads. Now, the colonial world begins to unravel. One by one, nations declare independence. India, Ghana, Jamaica, Nigeria, Pakistan, Kenya, Trinidad. But many choose to keep English as a unifying tongue, a neutral choice in multilingual countries where no single native language can serve as the standard. They keep it, not out of affection, but out of function. It is the language of exams, of bureaucracy, of law, the language of air traffic control, of international diplomacy, of treaties and textbooks. The United Nations, formed in the aftermath of war, chooses 6 official languages. English is one of them. So is French, Spanish, Russian, Arabic, and Chinese. But English becomes the most used, quietly, steadily. Then, as the Cold War sets in, 2 English-speaking countries dominate the Western world, the United States and the United Kingdom, and both invest heavily in information, in broadcasting, in global communication. The BBC begins its world service, sending English-language news across shortwave radio into distant places. The Voice of America does the same. In homes with radios, tuned carefully, listeners in Poland, Ghana, Iran, or Burma might hear the same cadence of headlines read in clipped English or soft American drawl. Then, a technological shift. The late 20th century brings the rise of the computer, and with it, English becomes embedded quite literally into the foundation of the digital world. The early coding languages, like BASIC and HTML, are built using English words: print, if, then, end. The first email systems, the first browsers, the first software manuals, written in English. Even today, many programming languages default to it, not because it is better suited, but because it was simply there at the beginning. And once a structure is laid down, it is hard to unbuild it. In universities, scientific journals begin to publish overwhelmingly in English. A physicist in Sweden, a chemist in India, a biologist in Brazil must write in English if they wish to be widely read. A medical student in Argentina might study anatomy in Spanish, but she will still learn the names of muscles and procedures in their English variants. A business school in Egypt might teach local economics, but its textbooks will often come from London or New York. And so, even as local languages flourish in daily life, English becomes the language of upward mobility, of travel, of access. Then comes the internet, quietly, then quickly. In the early days of the web, the vast majority of websites are created by American and British users. Domains, platforms, emails, all are registered and written in English. Even as the web becomes global, English remains dominant. Search engines work best in it. Early Wikipedia pages are written in it. Social media begins in it. And yet, again, the English being used is not singular. It has changed again. Online users from every country contribute to what English is. Memes, slang, abbreviations. Global youth culture creates a shared, informal dialects, sometimes grammatically unusual, always inventive. Someone in Manila posts a comment. Someone in Istanbul replies. Someone in Nairobi reads it. The language linking them is English, but not classroom English. It is alive, shortened, punctuated with emoji and tone. Words drop, vowels, letters stretch for effect. Sue, tired, yeses. Even within countries, English becomes a social signal. In cities like Lagos, Jakarta, or Mumbai, it may signal education, class, or cosmopolitan identity. Code switching becomes common, moving between English and local languages in the same sentence. Not confused, but fluid. An everyday dance. And now, English lives, not just in formal places, but in homes, on phones, in games, in songs. Today, it is estimated that more than 1.5 billion people speak some form of English, but only about 400 million speak it as their first language. That means most English speakers learned it the way we learn any language, when we need it, not out of love, but out of utility. For work, for study, for travel, for friendship. And perhaps that is why English stayed. Not because it was imposed, not because it was perfect, but because, over time, it became available. It was the language most often waiting at the airport, printed on the manual, used in the forum, subtitled in the film, spoken by the customer service line. It stayed because, like water, finding the lowest point, it flowed where it was easiest to go. And even now, it changes, in podcasts, in voice messages, in video subtitles, in texts. The language shifts again. It adapts to new voices, new idioms, new technologies. There is no final version of English, no perfect form. There is only the one you hear, the one you speak, the one shaped by history, yes, but also by you. And so, as the night draws on, we are left not with a single answer, but with a quiet realization that language is a journey, not a destination, and English, perhaps more than any other, has never stopped moving. Picture the subcontinent in the mid-1800s. Warm air rises gently off the baked earth. Banyan trees stretch wide beside stone roads, and ox carts creak slowly past government buildings trimmed with British balustrades and archways. In cities like Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, something is shifting, not in thunder or violence, but in ink and paper, in syllables shaped at school desks, in conversations held with careful precision. English has come here, not just in the voice of soldiers or traders, but in ledgers, court records, lesson plans. The British East India Company, once a merchant enterprise, now governs as a sovereign power. Through revenue offices and law courts, it draws India into an administrative web. And at the center of this web is language. English becomes the language of bureaucracy, of civil service exams and postal ledgers, of banking memoranda and tax assessments. For those who wish to rise within this new order, learning English is not just helpful, it is essential. Imagine a young man in Calcutta. He wakes before the sun. He lights a small oil lamp and opens a grammar book printed in London. He practices aloud. The pen is on the table. I have written a letter. It was received with thanks. He does not speak this way at home. His mother tongue may be Bengali or Urdu or Tamil, but English, for him, is the path to stability, to salary, 2 office walls, and a chair of his own dot. In 1835, a policy is announced in London, the Minute on Indian Education, penned by Thomas Babington Macaulay. He argues that India's future elite should be educated in English. He does not suggest preserving or promoting local languages. Instead, he proposes creating what he famously calls a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. These words, quietly read in Parliament and classrooms, shape a generation. Across the subcontinent, English medium schools are founded. At first, they serve the sons of zemindars and aspiring professionals. Later, they expand further. The curriculum includes arithmetic, geography, European history. Students copy English poetry. They read essays by Addison and Steele. They memorize proverbs. They learn to compose letters of request and complaint. But they also learn something deeper: how to think within a particular framework of expression. The passive voice, the polite refusal, the official tone. The empire does not enforce English violently in most of India. It does not ban native languages, nor destroy village scripts, but it rewards English. It builds ladders that only English can climb. In time, those who master the language become translators, clerks, magistrates. They staff the machinery of empire, and gradually they make English their own. By the end of the 19th century, a new Indian intelligentsia is forming. These are lawyers, professors, journalists. They write essays in English. They deliver speeches in it. They form political associations. The very language once used to govern becomes the language of resistance. The Indian National Congress holds its sessions in English. Petitions to the British Crown are drafted in English. Even Gandhi, though he later favors simplicity and local languages, is trained in English law and writes many of his early treatises in that tongue. Now imagine a courtroom in Bombay, perhaps. Around 1902, the judge wears a white wig and speaks in deliberate English. The lawyers do too. The defendant may not fully understand. He listens to his case discussed in a language that has slipped between him and justice. He relies on translation. He waits for meaning to return to him in words he knows. Even outside the courts, English leaves its mark. In the growing middle class, homes of Madras and Lahore, tea is served not only with milk, but with conversation peppered by English phrases. School children recite lines from Shakespeare. English newspapers circulate among shopkeepers and clerks. Advertisements sell soap and sewing machines in elegant, imported prose. The language, which arrived as an instrument of administration, becomes something Mara shared reference, a bridge between regions with dozens of languages, hundreds of dialects. But it is not unchallenged. Debates emerge. Should Indians continue to teach their children in English? Or should Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, or Tamil take its place? Should legal proceedings be conducted in the language of the colonizer, or returned to older tongues of power? The answer, then as now, remains complicated. By the time India wins independence in 1947, English is firmly embedded, not just in the machinery of government, but in habits, in minds, in margins of schoolbooks. The newly independent nation faces a question. What language should it speak now? There is no single national tongue. Hindi is spoken widely, but not universally. Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Marathi, Punjabi all are deeply rooted, proudly regional. English, though foreign, offers a kind of neutrality. It has no caste. It favors no region. And so it remains, quietly, as one of the country's official languages, not out of love, but out of compromise. And in the decades that follow, India begins to produce something remarkable: English literature, not from London, but from Delhi, and Mumbai and Bangalore. Writers like R.K. Narayan, Arundhati Roy, Salman Rushdie. Their sentences curve with Indian sensibilities, their metaphors drawn from mango groves and monsoon roads. It is not English as the British spoke it. It is something new. Even in casual speech, Indian English develops its own patterns. Do one thing, kindly revert. Passed out, meaning graduated. Idioms, phrases, even accents all shaped by Indian context, Indian rhythm. Today, India is one of the largest English-speaking countries in the world. But its English is not the Queen's. It is not even America's. It is India's. And that quiet transformation, born of colonial structure and reshaped by cultural resilience, is one of the most significant chapters in the story of global English. In the next part, we will drift gently toward the Caribbean, where English took root in very different soil, among displaced people, in lands bound by sugar and salt water. There, too, English adapted, not from books and classrooms, but from survival. The sea surrounds everything. Warm, blue water stretches softly around each island, lapping against white shores and curling quietly beneath wooden piers. Palm trees rustle in the slow wind. Bread trees cast wide, dappled shadows over narrow lanes. In the early morning, chickens strut between shacks and stone cottages. The smell of salt and wood smoke hangs in the air. This is the Caribbean, sometime in the 18th century, a place of sugar plantations, of quiet villages tucked into hills, of harbors filled with merchant ships and chained memories. Here, English came with a whip in its hand. Colonists arrived from England in the 1600s and 1700s, building plantations on land seized from indigenous peoples. But they could not work the fields themselves, nor persuade many to labor for them. So they looked outward, across the Atlantic. And from West Africa, they brought enslaved people in staggering numbers, millions over the centuries, them into a world not of their choosing, under a language not their own. On the plantations of Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Kitts English was spoken by overseers and owners. It was the language of commands, of punishment, of inventory. The enslaved, ripped from dozens of African cultures and languages, found themselves having to make sense of this new tongue. not in classrooms, but in fields and kitchens, under duress. Out of that broken contact, something new began to form. Creole. Languages, hybrid tongues that mixed English vocabulary with African grammar. Tone, rhythm, and structure merged in quiet defiance. They were not taught. They were not authorized. They were whispered in work songs, shared in secret, sung at night under the stars. Imagine a group of women pounding cassava in the yard of a small plantation in Grenada. One speaks Wolof, another Igbo, a third Arkan, but all of them understand enough English to work, and in their mingling, a new language grows. Me picni for my child. Me na go, for I will not go. The rules shift. The verbs simplify. The music remains. To outsiders, Creole sounded like broken English, but it was not broken. It was functional. It was alive. It carried memories of other homelands, encoded in sound. As generations passed, these Creoles deepened. Children born on the islands grew up speaking them natively. English remained the language of church, sermons, and laws. But the language of laughter, of songs, of warnings and comfort, that was Creole. British colonial officials, arriving to manage and rule, often underestimated the linguistic richness around them. They heard accents, misread idioms, dismissed the Creoles as corrupt or unworthy. But the people who lived on the islands knew their own meanings, knew how to speak two ways, sometimes three. In classrooms, British-style education was introduced at first, then more widely. English was taught formally. Students learned the Queen's grammar, recited moral lessons, but they left those rooms and returned to the patois of home. The two tongues lived side by side, in the same houses, in the same voices. Over time, especially in the 20th century, Standard English began to rise in status. It became the language of opportunity, of upward movement. Radio broadcasts, civil service positions, formal newspapers acquired a command of Standard English. But still, Creole remained. It lived in the gaps. It slipped into conversation. When formality faded, it danced in calypso lyrics, echoed in market chatter, shaped jokes that would lose their power if translated. In Jamaica, English is the official language, but Jamaican patois is the heartbeat. It is vibrant. It shifts easily between sounds and registers. Midea, I am here. Wagwan, what's going on? These are not just phrases. They are cultural anchors. In Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, St. Lucie Islands' version of Creole is distinct. Some lean more toward French or Spanish influence. Others hold more closely to African structures. But all are shaped, at least partly, by English. In the later years of empire. As colonial governments established more schools and sought to promote proper speech, tensions grew. How much of the local voice should be erased? How much of identity is bound in sound? Many islanders became expert in code switching. They spoke one English at work, another with family. One to the judge, another to the fruit vendor. Both forms valid, both fluent. Then came independence. The mid-20th century brought flags lowered, new anthems sung, constitutions written. But English remained the official language in most Caribbean nations, not as a symbol of love for Britain, but as a practical tool. A shared base among people whose ancestors had come from many places. And still, the Creole voices remained. They were not pushed away. They were carried forward. Imagine, now, a schoolteacher in St. Vincent in the 1980s. She opens her textbook and teaches her students the standard forms: subject, verb, object, proper punctuation. But she knows that when the bell rings and they spill outside into the sunlight, they will shift instantly into Creole. Words their grandparents used, words that rise up from soil, from C. In music. The voice of the Caribbean becomes global. Reggae, dancehall, calypso. The lyrics are often in English, but softened, twisted, bent with local color. The world sings along, not always knowing every word. But the feeling carries, and in literature, to the Caribbean English voice rises. Writers like Louise Bennett, Derek Walcott, Calmo Brathwaite use the full range of expression from Queen's English to Island Patois, tell stories of migration, memory, and belonging. Caribbean English is not a relic of empire. It is a response to it, a reinvention, a resilience. It is the sound of freedom spoken in the rhythms of survival, a language not inherited, but reassembled. And it remains today, strong and soft at once. The heat settles gently over the savannah, in the shade of a corrugated tin roof. Children sit in wooden desks, their notebooks open, their pencils worn down to soft nubs. A teacher writes slowly on the chalkboard, the words familiar now. The cow is in the field. I am going to the market. The letters are Roman, the grammar British, the pronunciation local. This is a classroom in Kenya in the early 20th century. One of many. English has arrived in Africa, but not all at once, and not everywhere in the same way. It moves slowly, at first traveling with missionaries, traders, and colonial agents. Then it moves faster, with steam engines and school inspectors, with typewriters and rubber stamps. The British Empire spread over vast stretches of the continent: Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and more rich regions shaped by different histories, cultures, and native languages. But across those differences, English was introduced as a neutral tongue, or so the colonial governments claimed. In truth, it was never neutral. It was a tool of administration, of law, of taxation. But it was also a promise. For those who learned it well, a door opened, sometimes only a crack, sometimes wide enough to walk through. A job in the civil service, a position in the police, a role in the courts, or, later, a seat at the negotiating table for independence. In places like Nigeria, where hundreds of languages coexisted, English became a lingua franca taught in colonial schools, used in government offices, printed in newspapers. But it was not just transplanted, it was adapted. Nigerian English today is rich with local idioms and cadences. Your welcome becomes a greeting, Goslow describes. A traffic jam. Phrases shift, and yet the meaning holds. In Ghana, schoolchildren once recited British poems beneath dusty mango trees. They wrote essays on English kings and learned the geography of places they might never see. But over time, Ghanaian English became its own, direct, rhythmic, confident. In South Africa, the story becomes more tangled. English arrived early, but it had to share space with Afrikaans, with Zulu, Xhosa, Southo, under apartheid. English was taught, but often withheld. It became, paradoxically, both the language of official power and the language of resistance. When Nelson Mandela stood to speak at his trial, he spoke in English not to his captors, but to the world. Calm, deliberate, unwavering. The language of empire turned slowly into the language of liberation. Throughout the continent, English often coexisted uneasily with native tongues. Colonial schools discouraged the use of mother languages, claiming that English was the key to modernity. And yet, in homes, in markets, in music and storytelling, those native languages never disappeared. Instead, a layered way of speaking emerged. Code switching became second nature. A student might greet her teacher in formal English, then whisper a joke in Try or Shona to her friend. A business contract might be written in perfect legal English, while the actual negotiation took place in Hausa or Swahili. And over time, African literature in English began to blossom. Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Buchi Emoseta, writers who took the colonizers' language and used it to tell their own stories of village life, of conflict, of memory, of change. Today, African Englishes continue to evolve. On social media, in films, in classrooms, in prayer. The language bends easily, shaped by new generations. It is no longer taught just to mimic the British tongue. It is used to express identity. And from Africa, we move eastward, drifting slowly over the Red Sea toward the Middle East. There too, English arrived softly at first, in trade, in treaties, and later, through oil, diplomacy, and education. The desert stretches wide, quiet beneath a pale sky. In a conference room, cooled by humming air conditioners, men in suits speak carefully across a polished table. There, words are not in Arabic, or Farsi, or Kurdish. They are in English. It is the late 20th century. The world has changed again. And in the Middle East, English has become the language of negotiation. Unlike in India or Africa, English did not arrive in the Middle East through large-scale settlement or deep educational reform. Here, the language came primarily through commerce, military alliances, and diplomacy. In the early 1900s, as British interests grew in the Persian Gulf, English was introduced in port towns Kuwait, Bahrain, Basrayas, the language of shipping, contracts, and customs. After the discovery of oil in the region, English became tied to engineering and finance. Western companies trained local workers. Instruction manuals, safety signs, blueprints all written in English. And in cities like Cairo and Beirut, a new kind of school began to appear. International schools, often British or American in structure, taught science and math in English. Children from elite families, or those with aspirations abroad, enrolled in growing numbers. In these classrooms, students read English novels and memorized vocabulary lists. They diagrammed sentences and learned the formalities of business correspondence. They might still speak Arabic at home, but English became a passport to global opportunity. In the decades after World War II, English gained further ground, not as a colonial language, but as a practical one. The rise of air travel, international business, and satellite media made English more visible. In hotels, airports, universities, on television, in training manuals, in diplomatic cables, across the Gulf states. Newly rich from oil, English became the standard for corporate communication, and in countries like Jordan and Lebanon, it was widely used in higher education, but in many places, it remained a second or third layer, not replacing native languages, but weaving through them. You might hear English used in a business pitch, and then hear Arabic spoken softly in the hallway moments later. A YouTube tutorial might explain makeup techniques in English, even if the speaker is fluent in Persian today. English in the Middle East is not bound by colonial memory, but by media, commerce, and aspiration. And still, it shifts. Slang from the UK, catchphrases from American sitcoms, internet idioms all mix with regional accents and cultural norms. The result is a local English, one that reflects the complex identities of its speakers. From here, we'll drift slowly southeast past the mountains of Iran, past the rice fields of Bengal, into the tropical warmth of Southeast Asia, another place where English arrived gently, but stayed deeply. The morning rain falls softly over a narrow road in Penang. Trees glisten, their leaves wet with the night's humidity. The air smells of spice and stone and something green lush and rising. Beneath a wide veranda roof, children remove their sandals before stepping into a whitewashed classroom. The fans overhead turn slowly. Chalk dust hovers near the board. The lesson begins. The teacher writes in neat capital letters. The sun rises in the east. The British Empire was very large. We are learning English in Southeast Asia. The British came with ships and treaties. They came to Singapore, to Malaya, to Burma. They came for rubber, for tin, for tea. And with them, slowly came English. It was not always taught with intention. In many early years, the British governed through intermediaries, through local rulers and sultans. But as the empire's presence deepened, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they built schools. Not for everyone, but for those they believed would serve the system. In British Malaya, English medium schools were often established in urban centres. Penang, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore. The curriculum was British Dickens and geography, Newton and empire maps. A student might study Hamlet in the morning and learn about British kings in the afternoon. Imagine a boy named Amir, the son of a modest shopkeeper. His family speaks Malay at home, but in school, Amir reads in English. He memorizes poems and learns to write formal letters. One day, perhaps, he'll work in an office with wooden filing cabinets and ceiling fans, taking notes at a tick desk. He will be expected to speak to colonial officers in polished tones. And so he practices. Yes, sir, I understand, sir. May I offer a suggestion? In Singapore, the British administration encouraged the use of English as a common thread among Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities. The city became a crossroads, a port of voices. English allowed trade to flow smoothly and bureaucracy to function. But in the markets and the homes, dozens of other languages still thrived. In Burma, the story took another shape. English was used by colonial administrators and by those few Burmese who served in the British legal or education systems, but it never fully took root among the broader population. It remained a language of government, not of the people, even. So, its influence lingered in signs, in titles, in the vocabulary of law and medicine. During World War II, as the region was caught in the shifting tides of occupation and resistance, English fell silent in some places, only to return later, with renewed significance. After the war, as colonies moved toward independence, English remained not always by design, but by habit. And when independence came, countries in the region had to choose whether to continue using English in education and governance, or whether to turn fully toward national languages. In Malaysia and Singapore, English was retained, though in very different ways. In Malaysia, efforts were made to strengthen the use of Malay, yet English continued in many secondary schools and in science and technology. It remained useful, practical. In Singapore, the choice was more deliberate. The government maintained English as the primary language of instruction and administration. It was not because English was beloved, but because it was neutral. In a Multicultural nation, English offered no special favor to any single ethnic group. It became the language of unity, and so, the Singaporean model emerged. Students learn English from their earliest years, while still retaining fluency in a mother tongue. The result is a local English precise, clipped, infused with rhythm. Singlish, as it's sometimes called, blends English with Hokkien Malay. Tamil, phrases like LA and can carry deep cultural weight, even as the grammar remains recognizably English. Today, Southeast Asian English is not one thing. In Malaysia, it carries different tones from the English spoken in the Philippines or Brunei. In each place, the colonial past whispers differently, and still, the British Empire's imprint remains. It is found in place names, in institutional titles, in exam systems, in the way students write essays, in the format of parliamentary debate, in the style of legal drafting. But the English spoken now is no longer an echo of the British voice. It is local, lived in, shifted by heat, by history, by the slow wear of daily use. From here we move again gently, eastward across the sea to the Pacific. There, scattered across islands large and small, the empire brought English by way of missionaries, settlers, and civil servants. And there too, the language stayed. Across a vast ocean, scattered like green pearls on a deep blue cloth, lie the islands of the Pacific. Some are large, mountainous, and forested like New Zealand. Others are small atolls, ringed with palms and touched constantly by wind and tide. The sea here is not a border but a road, connecting island to island, canoe to canoe, song to song, and then, eventually, to English. The British did not come to the Pacific in a single wave. They arrived slowly at first, through explorers and traders, then missionaries, then settlers. Each came with language in their satchels, the Bible, the ledger, the letter of introduction, and gradually, English began to take hold. In Australia, the empire arrived with chains. In 1788, the first fleet carried more than 700 convicts from Britain to a place they called New South Wales. The British considered the land empty terra nullius even, though it had been lived in and cared for by Aboriginal peoples for tens of thousands of years. The penal colony grew into a settlement, then into a city, and from that city a society emerged draft, sunstruck, English-speaking, yet far removed from the sound of Westminster. The English that developed in Australia kept many British roots, but it took on its own texture. Words were shortened, slang was born. The rhythm became different, slower, flatter, shaped by heat and distance. But beneath that colonial layer, other voices persisted. Aboriginal languages remained, though often pushed to the edges. Children were taken into English only. Institutions, place names were and for generations, the English taught in schools was not just a tool, was a replacement. In New Zealand, the British arrived in the early 1800s, signing treaties and establishing missions. One of the most famous, the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, was intended to formalize British authority. But its versions in English and Mbori differed subtly, significantly. The consequences would echo for centuries. English became the language of law, of courts, of government. But the Mbori language, rich and deeply embedded in identity, continued. And in time, it would return to classrooms, to signs, to song. Farther across the ocean, the British established protectorates and colonies in places like Fiji, the Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea. sometimes directly, sometimes through missionary groups who built schools and churches, translating Christian scripture into local dialects, and teaching children to read not in their own language, but in English. Imagine a small wooden schoolhouse on an island in the late 1800s, the roof thatched, the walls thin, the bell rung with a length of rope. Children sit cross-legged on mats. A teacher, perhaps from Britain, or perhaps from a local village trained by mission programs, stands before them. The lesson begins. The sky is blue. Jesus loves me. I must be kind. The English is clear, careful, and unfamiliar. In many places, these schools provided the first exposure to literacy. And for many, that literacy came only in English. But it was not only religion and reading, it was colonial administration. In places like Fiji, where indentured laborers were brought from India under British contracts, English became the medium through which orders were given, disputes were resolved, and lives were recorded. In government files, across the Pacific, English took on different roles. In Australia and New Zealand, it became the dominant language of national identity, shaped by settler narratives and distance from the imperial centre. In other islands, it remained more functional, a bridge between multiple local languages, or a path to migration, employment, higher education. Today, Pacific Englishes are many. In Papua New Guinea, Tok Pisin, an English-based Creole, is widely spoken, mixing English roots with local grammar and pronunciation. Me go longhouse, I am going home. It is not incorrect. It is its own form, born of necessity, shaped by culture. In New Zealand, English and Bori now live together officially. Government signs appear in both. Ceremonies open with Karakio prayers spoken in Bori. English is no longer the only voice in the room. In Australia, too, there is growing awareness of the linguistic history long buried. Aboriginal English varieties, spoken across communities, retain rhythms and idioms rooted in the old tongues. You mob coming, proper good country, this one. Words familiar in form but filled with local meaning. Yet even today, English holds the position of power. It is the language of courts, of universities, of migration documents, but it no longer speaks with a single voice. The English of the Pacific is diverse. It carries echoes of the empire, but also of the canoe, the drum, the school bell, the silent resistance of students who thought in two languages at once. From these islands, we begin to drift north again toward the final movements of empire, and the places where English arrived by partnership more than conquest: Hong Kong, Malaysia, the post-war Commonwealth, and finally, into the age of digital media and migration. The room is dark, except for the glow of a screen. The quiet hum of a computer fills the air. Somewhere, a teenager scrolls through a video. The voice is in English, subtitled, perhaps, or not. The words are fast but familiar. In Manila, in Warsaw, in Nairobi, in Seoul. The accent might shift, the idioms might confuse, but the listener understands enough. Enough to laugh, enough to learn, enough to belong. This is the new way English travels, not by ships or soldiers, but by signal. Not on parchment or in leather-bound books, but through pixels and playlists. The 20th century had already prepared the ground. The Second World War made English a language of international coordination. The Cold War turned it into a diplomatic tool. But it was the second half of the century and the quiet rise of media technologies that made English something else entirely. something ambient, constant in the 1950s and 60s. English language films began to fill theaters far from Hollywood. American movies, dubbed or subtitled, became weekend events in cities across the globe. James Bond in Cairo, Disney in Bangkok, Marilyn Monroe in Buenos Aires. Even when translated, the original words lingered beneath. Cool, sorry, okay. These words slipped into local usage, unannounced. Then came television, sitcoms and dramas broadcast by satellite or tape delay reached audiences in dozens of countries. In many places, dubbed versions dominated, but in others, especially in Northern and Eastern Europe, subtitles were preferred, meaning English was not only heard, but absorbed, little by little. Over time, and then, in the final decades of the century, came the revolution that would change everything: the internet. At first, it was quiet, a strange tool for researchers, a curiosity. But almost immediately, English was its dominant language, not by design, but by habit. The first programming languages were built in English. The first message boards, the first emails, the first help menus. And so, the early internet was an English-speaking place. Not exclusive, but tilted. The interface said file and edit and send. The message said 404, page not found. The instructions said sign up and log in. Users from around the world joined nonetheless. They learned the structure quickly. A few words were enough. Username, password, click here. Imagine a young woman in Indonesia. Early 2000s, she logs onto a chat room late at night. The site is in English. Her grammar is not perfect, but she types anyway. Hello, I like books. Where you from? A boy in Egypt responds. A girl in Romania joins. None of them speak English natively, but they all understand one another just enough. This is not the English of textbooks. It is abbreviated, emotive, shorthand. It evolves quickly. LOL, BRB. Oh my god, emojis begin to carry meaning beyond language. A single heart, a thumbs up, a smile with a tear. The rise of social media magnifies it. Facebook, launched in English, becomes global. Twitter too, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Even when platforms begin to support other languages, English remains present. It is often the default, often the shared base. And this, perhaps, is the quiet truth of the modern digital world. English is not always chosen out of admiration. It is chosen because it is there, because it is visible, because it is common ground. A tutorial on how to fix a bike tire, recorded in Texas, is watched in Morocco. A Minecraft stream, spoken in English with a heavy Nordic accent, is followed by a child in Brazil. They might not understand every word, but they understand enough. The visual helps, the context carries. In workplaces, especially those online, English becomes the language of international collaboration. A software engineer in India, a designer in Poland, a marketer in Vietnam might speak different native tongues, but their shared Slack messages, their emails, their bug reports will often be in English. And in science, the pattern continues. The overwhelming majority of academic journals publish in English. Peer-reviewed research, international conferences, grant proposals, all in a language that many researchers have to learn on top of their own. It is not always fair. English is a second or third language for billions of people, yet fluency in it is often required for access to knowledge, to opportunity, to connection. Still, the language changes. gently, invisibly. Online English is now shaped as much by non-native speakers as by native ones. Global slang emerges, same, mood, low-key. These expressions might begin in one place, but they travel fast, picked up, repurposed, sent back out. Memes flatten accents, texts shorten grammar, even spelling begins to shift. American and British spellings coexist. Color and color, center and center. Users type what feels natural, sometimes what is auto-corrected, and through all of it, the voice of empire fades into the background. Most of the people speaking English online today do not speak it because of Britain. They speak it because it helps them reach others. But the legacy remains. The structures built long ago, the schools, the civil service systems, the textbooks slayed, the foundation, the digital world simply built upon it, extended it, amplified it. Today, English is less a national language than a global tool. It no longer belongs to one country. It belongs to the speaker, to the user, to the texter and the streamer, the researcher and the coder. And so, we speak English. We write in it. We watch in it. Often without thinking. Often without remembering how it got here. But beneath the casual tone of a tweet, beneath the clean interface of an app, the long shadows of history still linger. They hum quietly behind every login screen. And from here, we will move softly into the next part, where English meets migration, where families carry it with them across oceans, between generations, between identities. Picture a kitchen at dusk. The light is warm and low. A pot simmers quietly on the stove, releasing the scent of garlic, ginger, cumin, or perhaps something sweet, like cinnamon and milk. In the corner, a child reads from a worksheet spread across the table. The words are in English. My name is Sarah. I live in London. I have 2 brothers. Across from her, an older woman, her grandmother, listens, smiling, but not fully following. Her English is careful, soft at the edges. She speaks with pauses. She understands more than she says. This is the shape of English in the world of migration, a language that crosses borders, not as a conqueror, but as a bridge, a requirement, a compromise, a place between homes. In the 20th century, as the sun set slowly on the British Empire, many who had once lived under its flag began to move, invited by work, driven by war, shaped by hope. They came to Britain from the Caribbean, from South Asia, from West Africa. They arrived in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand. Some went farther still, finding English-speaking communities in the United States, or smaller outposts across the globe. And with them, they brought other languages: Hindi, Yoruba, Punjabi, Patois, Arabic, Tagalog, Urdu. These remained close to the heart, but English was the language of immigration forms, of airport announcements, of housing offices and bus routes. It was the language of necessity. Imagine a man from Lahore arriving in Birmingham in the 1970s. He speaks fluent Urdu and some formal English learned at school. But the English he hears on the street is unfamiliar, faster, full of local slang. Still, he adapts. Slowly, he finds work, learns the phrases. Cheers, tar, right, then. At home, he speaks in his mother tongue. But his children return from school with new accents, new habits. Soon, English becomes the language they share only halfway. The child dreams in English. The parent thinks in their first language. Between them, a quiet dance begins. The child helps with paperwork. The parent tells stories from another. time in another tongue. This pattern repeats across the world. In Toronto, Somali families balance prayer in Arabic with school assemblies in English. In Sydney, Vietnamese elders pass down recipes while their grandchildren explain apps. In Auckland, a Samoan father watches proudly as his son gives a speech at school in fluent, easy English, words he never had at that age. English becomes not just a global language, but a generational one. Often, the first generation speaks it sparingly. The second becomes fluent. The third speaks only it. In many households, English lives alongside silence, words left unsaid between parent and child, because the vocabulary has shifted. I love you may feel easier in English, but harder to say aloud. A story may remain untold, because the right phrase does not quite exist anymore. Yet English also becomes the medium for growth. It allows the child to write poetry, to debate, to apply for university, to navigate forms that once baffled their parents. It becomes a tool not only of survival, but of becoming, and with it, new forms of English emerge. In London, multicultural London English blends Cockney, Caribbean rhythms, South Asian phrasing, and more. Safe, brove, mandem, that's peak. It is playful, alive, local. In New York, Black English vernacular, shaped by history and community, adds cadence and clarity, style and strength. Ain't nobody got time for that. Stay woke, it be like that. Each version of English reflects the movement of people, of food, of music, of culture. It grows from corners where languages meet and linger. At weddings, in mosques, in temples, in family WhatsApp groups, English appears in fragments. Half a sentence here, a caption there, a prayer translated, a joke recast. It becomes the shared tongue of strangers. Two migrants from different countries may meet in a factory canteen, speaking different first languages, but English becomes the bridge. How long you been here? Good pay, you got family. The answers matter less than the fact they are understood, even when not perfect. The English spoken by migrants carries dignity, purpose, every word a step forward, every phrase a sign of effort. In time, children grow up and become translators, not just of words, but of worlds. They move easily between accents, between registers. They explain to teachers, to doctors, to officials. They write resumes for their cousins. They fill in online forms for their grandparents. They become the interpreters of their families' journey, but they also face a question. What will they pass on? Some teach their children only English, hoping to protect them from being different. Others fight to keep the old language alive. But often, over time, English remains the dominant voice, not out of preference, but because it is always present, at school, on television, in every toy that talks, and so English becomes the backdrop. A constant hum, a neutral default, but even then, it is not plain, not standard, not static. It is shaped by every kitchen, every bus ride, every lullaby slightly mistranslated, every nickname, half English, half home. The English of migrants is not a borrowed language. It is a created one, made new each day by those who speak it not from inheritance, but from necessity, from love, from distance, from hope. And so it continues to spread, not by conquest, not by curriculum, but by quiet repetition. One word at a time, one family at a time. From here, we move gently toward the closing turns of our story. Next, we will explore how English became a global standard for business, aviation, science, and diplomacy. Not as culture, but as structure. A soft infrastructure of words behind many of the world's most formal systems. A flight descends slowly into a quiet evening sky. The voice of the pilot comes over the speaker, calm and clipped. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. A second voice crackles in his headset, coming from an air traffic controller far below. They are speaking English. They could be in Tokyo, or Nairobi, or Santiago. It makes no difference. The words are the same. The rhythm is practiced. This is how planes move safely through shared space. This is English not as poetry, but as protocol. In the modern world, beyond conversation and culture, English functions quietly as a structural tool, a framework behind systems that span continents, often invisible, often unacknowledged, but vital. It begins in aviation. After the Second World War, as international flights became common, safety became a global concern. Communication was critical. And so, in 1951, the International Civil Aviation Organization established English as the official language for all international flight operations. Not out of preference, but out of necessity. It meant that a pilot flying from Moscow to Johannesburg, or from Buenos Aires to Seoul, would speak to every tower in English. The phrases are rehearsed, predictable, requesting descent, cleared, for landing, wind from the west. Even in emergencies, clarity is key. English becomes the shared air through which instructions travel. Lives depend on understanding. In maritime operations, the pattern repeats. On ships crossing the Pacific, or docking at ports in the Mediterranean, English is used to coordinate, to signal, to record entries in the log. On the high seas, there is no room for confusion. And then there is business. In boardrooms lit by morning sun or late fluorescent flicker, executives from 5 countries sit around a table. The presentations are in English, not because all are fluent, but because it is the common ground. Contracts are drafted in English. Terms like stakeholder, revenue stream, memorandum, liability are now part of the global commercial vocabulary. A meeting between a Japanese manufacturer, a German distributor, and a South African client will likely be held in English. Or at least, the emails will be dot. English becomes the language of negotiation, not just in tone, but in form. Phrases like, per our previous conversation, please advise, or attached here with signal formal distance, politeness, authority. Even for speakers who use different sentence structures at home, these forms become familiar, expected on law, too. English has spread beyond its origin. Common law systems, which developed in England, have influenced legal structures across many former colonies, and with them came the legal language terms like habeas corpus, breach of contract, power of attorney, often dense, often precise. Used globally in science, the influence is even broader. English is now the dominant language of academic publishing. Most major journals accept articles only in English. A study conducted in Peru or Thailand or Poland will often be written in English if it is to be cited widely. This does not mean the work is better, only that the audience is broader. For many researchers, English is a second or third language. Writing an academic paper becomes a dual effort, explaining the science and mastering the structure of English prose. And yet, the incentive is clear. A paper in English will reach more readers, It will be easier to share at international conferences. It will be understood across borders. In diplomacy, the shift is similar. The United Nations has 6 official languages, but English is the most commonly used in everyday communication. It is the language of draft resolutions, of technical meetings, of working groups. The European Union uses many languages, but in practice, English is a frequent bridge between delegates who do not share a native tongue. Even after Britain left the EU, English remained. In humanitarian work, NGOs operating in dozens of countries often default to English when coordinating responses. Disaster relief, refugee coordination, medical supply logistics all are organized in the simplest common form. But this utility comes with a quiet cost. For those whose first language is not English, there is often an extra layer of effort. Understanding formal phrasing, knowing when a word like interesting means polite praise or gentle criticism, decoding idioms, adjusting tone, and still they do. Every day, in offices, in labs, in courtrooms, in aid tents, across borders, because the system is already built. Once a structure like language becomes embedded in processes and manuals, in training materials, in international lit, becomes difficult to replace. Not because it is perfect, but because it is known, and so the words remain. Clear for takeoff, meeting adjourned, Article 5, terms and conditions apply. This is not the English of empire or poetry. It is the English of function. Quiet, firm, almost invisible. Yet behind every procedure spoken in English, there is a long history. Centuries of expansion, of education policies, of colonial administration, and later of media and commerce and migration. These systems did not choose English only for its flexibility. They used it because it was already there, and now it is. Everywhere, not just in what we say, but in how we organize the world. And yet, even this form of English continues to evolve. Slowly, naturally. A Japanese engineer might speak it differently than a Chilean economist or a Senegalese diplomat. The tone changes. The phrasing shifts. The understanding remains. From here, we will move gently into the final part of our journey. Not a conclusion, but a quiet reflection. The story of English is not over, and perhaps it never will be. It is. Evening now, not just in time, but in tone. The sky fades through soft grey into deeper blue. Lamps flicker on in distant windows. The day grows quiet, and English, ever present, drifts lightly through the spaces we move in. A voice on the news, a song playing from a neighbor's open window, a browser tab still open, its text in English, a half-finished email, a grocery label, a whisper in a dream. After centuries of travel, adaptation, resistance, and reuse, English rests in the corners of daily life, no longer as something carried with effort, but often simply there woven into habits, into systems, into conversation. It is hard now to say exactly what English is, or where it begins, or where it ends. It is not one language. The English spoken in a Johannesburg cafe is different from the English spoken in a classroom in Hanoi. The English of a Paris tech startup differs from the English in a New Delhi newsroom. In Lagos, it shifts between formal and local with every sentence. In Toronto, it may contain pieces of Tagalog, Farsi, Urdu, and French before breakfast. What once seemed like a single river has become a delta. Many mouths, many voices, and yet all still recognizably. English at airports, we still hear. Boarding now. In textbooks, we still see chapter 1. In contracts, whereas and hereby. In cartoons, oops and yay. In lullabies, the soft repetition of twinkle, twinkle, little star, and in each case, the words are understood. Maybe not completely, maybe not precisely, but enough to connect, enough to continue. That, perhaps, is the quiet strength of English, not in its grammar, not in its logic, but in its capacity to be used imperfectly and still work, to bend without breaking, to hold its shape, and yet take new ones. But with this global reach comes a question spoken quietly by teachers, by parents, by poets, by those who speak many languages, and those who feel they are slowly forgetting their own. What does it mean to live in a world where one language holds so much space? For some, it is convenient, a shared tool, a bridge. For others, it can feel like a shadow, something that arrives first, that fills the room, that makes less space for other voices. In classrooms around the world, students are praised for mastering English, even as their own languages lose ground. A child in Nairobi might write an essay in polished English, but stumble over how to describe her dreams in her grandmother's tongue. A teenager in Seoul might follow American YouTubers easily, but hesitate when writing a letter in Korean. These are not failures. They are symptoms of something broader. English has become a passport, but passports can be expensive, and they often come with rules. They do not always carry the warmth of home. And yet, despite this, English continues to grow, not as a fixed structure, but as a living web, spreading not just from London or New York, but from Nairobi, from Singapore, from Kingston, from Bangalore. It is being reshaped by billions of hands. The future of English may not sound like the English of the past. Already, its vocabulary is shifting, its grammar softening, its usage blending with memes, images, emojis. A shrug emoji might replace a paragraph. A TikTok sound might carry more meaning than a sentence. The lines between language and culture, speech and signal, continue to blur. But perhaps the real story is not just about English. It is about language itself, about how we speak to each other, how we find words for love, for fear, for memory, for the sky, about how language reflects power, but also hope, about how we inherit sounds and shape them into something our own. Do not have to speak perfect English to be part of this story. Perhaps you only understand some of these words. Perhaps you are listening while half asleep, the sounds blurring at the edges. That, too, is part of it. Because English is no longer a possession, it is a process, not owned, not finished. A long conversation, still unfolding, and so we leave. The story not with an ending, but with a breath. A gentle one, like the pause before a sentence, or the moment after someone says hello. Soft, open, waiting, and you are part of it. Thank you for listening. Rest now, let the words settle, sleep. If you wish, the language will still be here when you wake.